On. The publication of The New Negro, The Life of Alain Locke in 2018 made visible that in the 1920s, Black writers emerged whose writings led to the period being called the Harlem Renaissance. While usually narrated as a literary movement, the Harlem Renaissance forged connections amongst sociology, education, physics, and queer identity that continue to shape creative work today. Tonight, Chaucer's is pleased to host a discussion of some recent creative publications in education, science, history, and the novel by these 5 UCSB scholars sitting before you right now. And what they have done is not only shined in their field, but they made their own little renaissance here in Santa Barbara. To introduce them all and to moderate tonight's discussion, I would so pleased to bring our dear friend and our dear customer and just one of the greatest guys and a pretty dang good musician, as a lot of you know. Dr. Jeffrey Stewart, of course, if you haven't been in a hole, you've known he's won a Pulitzer Prize and a National Book Award for The New Negro. Please welcome everyone and please bring out Dr. Jeffrey Stewart.
So this was actually the result of conversations I've been having with Michael for a while, and just kind of having something to highlight Black history. I mean, obviously there've been other events here, but I thought it would be good to sort of, kind of bridge the sometimes gap that exists between UCSB and, Santa Barbara, and to also introduce some people who may not be that well known in Santa Barbara, who are relatively, some people have been here a long time, some people have gotten here just recently. So the whole idea here is basically to use my book as an excuse to introduce you to other books, right? And those other books then kind of can lead into more discussions about where we're going as a culture and the role that Black creatives and Black critical intelligence has played in that. So without further ado, I think I will just introduce briefly the people on the panel, and then we'll sort of get started. So first one, Frances Winddance Twine. She's a professor of sociology at UCSB, a longtime member of the community, also an ethnographer, visual artist, and someone who is a filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker, and actually right now working on a film adaptation of the book that she is going to be talking about today, called Geek Girls. I think it was published in 2017? 2020, of course during the pandemic, so a lot of things didn't get attention. I think it's just recently paperback is being issued of Geek Girls, and it really talks a lot about what's going on today in terms of Silicon Valley. So we'll be able to hear from her and all that. And the other thing I want to say is that everybody up here has a huge number of awards. But everyone up here has won awards for the work that they've done and are really innovators in the field. And that's true for Winddance. To my right here is Clifford Johnson. He's a theoretical physicist focusing on quantum physics, science consultant also to Hollywood artists, writers, and there's been, I think, a real breath of fresh air in the community that came here. I guess it was in 2023. Yeah, 2023. We threw him away from USC. They didn't deserve him. So we brought them all. Come on up here, to the Harlem of California. And he's just been fantastic. Really, he's the North Hall Chair. North Hall Chair was created by Black student activists to bring more people into areas outside of Black studies on campus, and we're just so fortunate to have him. Obviously, he, like Winddance, has published articles all over the place and done a lot of innovative work, but I was particularly interested when he introduced me to a book that he did called The Dialogues, Conversations About the Nature of the Universe. It's published in 2017, and it's really a graphic representation of science. And so, Clifford is a really big advocate of, advocating for science throughout our culture, throughout our lives, not just simply in the ivory tower, and a really innovative approach to teaching science in this book. So I thought that was a great thing to have him come and talk to us. To my left over here is Matt Richardson, associate professor in the Department of Physical Studies. He's a scholar, writer, creator, person who's an expert on literary criticism, queer theory, trans theory. He's really been, we also stole you away from the University of Texas. I mean, not that, it's hard at this point, but he came on up and he's been enriching us with his brilliance, not only as a scholar, but also as a creative writer. And I guess that's kind of a theme here with Winddance and Clifford, is that creative part is really something that I think is really something that we're doing up at UCSB, at least some people. Scholars, but also creativity. And he's basically produced 2 novels recently. One is called Black Canvas, A Campus Haunting, published in 2022. And his second fiction project, Angels of Mercy, Light and Fall, which appeared just this last fall in 2024. He's going to talk to us a little bit about that, kind of continuing the Harlem Renaissance emphasis on literature, which is also great. We have sociology, of science, and literature, and then last but not least, education. And so we're so glad to have Ling Sunshine Malone with us. As a professor, a researcher, consultant, a scholar, activist in the Department of Education here at UCSB. She's the author of several articles on education, and in particular, a book that she co-authored called Dismantling, Disproportionality in Practice, a guide to fostering culturally responsive districts and schools, with her colleagues Maria Hernandez and Reed Swire. And it's an innovative approach, and particularly from the Harlem Renaissance or New Negro standpoint, focus on youth and what role youth have to play. In terms of just framing things, I mean, I think I actually brought an early version of the book that started the whole thing, The New Negro, which was by Alain Locke in 1925. And this book, we're sort of celebrating this year the 100th anniversary of the publication. It was published in December of 1925, and really inspired my work. And I was trying to think about what to say about this book. It's itself a kind of graphic representation, because it has art, music, poetry, but also sociology, history, and that idea of interdisciplinarity is very important. But I think the most important thing that Locke tried to do was to engineer a kind of cognitive definition of cultural production as Black modernity. Obviously, throughout American history, there's been a lot of recognition of Black music, Black dance. Even Thomas Jefferson begrudgingly admitted that Black people were incredibly good at music. But he never said, but they don't have sublimity. They're not sublime. You see, he's taking out the cognitive element and sort of saying, it's maybe something natural or non-reflective. Locke, I think, for the first time, put this idea of the Negro, says, no, actually, if you look at it, all through American history, we've had this kind of creative thought process that has been evident in the music, the dance, how people dress, how people live the urban life, and also increasingly in the late 19 teens and early 1920s in science and history and sociology. People who were sort of graduating from colleges, many times HBCUs, I don't think they were called that at the time, but nevertheless, people who were essentially leaders, thinkers, creators, who are sort of trying to define a Black modernity. That is, not something in the past or rural or pastoral, but something modern, new, something that was 20th century and was very edgy, and particularly interested in how can we contribute and shape what is America. And I think that was in many ways very successful. He brought a lot of attention to that. People like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, those people who he promoted and advanced, they became really, I think, the architects of a lot of thought that we've had in the 1960s, certainly. Zora Neale Hurston probably being one of the most read authors from the Harlem Renaissance, and certainly even in high schools and other places, and a kind of a supporter of, for a forerunner of black feminism that's coming out. Also, Locke was queer, and he had struggled a lot of times with, you know, kind of the invisibility that was imposed on him by people in the NAACP and other places. He advocated for diversity as a good thing, and that was something obviously right now is under attack and criticism. I think for now, what we're thinking about too is just how do we move forward with the notion of black creativity, black thought in the 21st century. I myself am wrestling with this because a couple of weeks ago, my sister's house in Altadena burned to the ground, and it just made me aware that, you know, there's this whole climate change and the larger sense that we're all connected. Is there kind of this black modernism, but are we ready for a kind of black ecology of thinking how we relate to and activate and interact with and respond to these challenges, really to the earth that is really upon us right now, and that many people obviously don't take seriously enough. So anyway, that was kind of just a thought to kind of bring some people to you that you might not have you know, experienced or talked about or read their work. And so without that, that's enough about my work. I'm going to turn now to France, Winddance, Twine.
Okay. First, I want to thank everyone for coming out, and I see some of my colleagues here, Rich Aquawan, Karen, my Native American sister, Tony. So let me just say a few things about this book. I hope you do read it. So I am a sociologist, and most of my work until recently has been outside of the U.S. I've worked primarily in Brazil, the UK, and Ecuador, and all of my work has looked at the intersections of gender inequality and class inequality. This book was born because I had been commuting between here and the Bay Area for a period of 5 years, and I was really interested in, so we're going back now to 2014. In 2014, we started to become aware that a lot of people were being excluded from jobs in the tech industry. So for example, there was a black engineer at Twitter who quit, and he turned out he was the only black engineer at Twitter, period. And so I started trying to understand what was happening in the tech industry, which was the economic engine for the state and has generated a lot of money. But we started to see, beginning in 2014 and 2015, we started to see a series of gender and racial discrimination lawsuits. So we started seeing Asian women, white women, and other people basically identifying overt patterns of discrimination operating at Cisco, Twitter, Oracle, Google. Facebook rebranded themselves as Meta in part in reaction to this. So what I did is I started looking at all the literature inspired by some of my colleagues on labor and labor studies. And within sociology, no one had really gone out and interviewed women in the industry. And I was interested in the diversity of experiences among women and how they ended up in tech. And one of the mythologies that was operating among the CEOs when they were asked to explain why only 4 to 5% of the workforce was Black and Latinx, well, it's public education. They're not getting the skills we need. They're not educated. They don't want these jobs. This is what was being said on all of the talk shows. It's not our fault. We can't help it. These are the same arguments that we heard at Harvard in the 1990s when they had to explain why they didn't have any blacks in the law school. We just can't find any people Black in North America qualified to be here. So there were these arguments, and I started looking for the data, and I realized there wasn't any data. And so what I learned was that the US government had colluded with the tech industry to allow them not to publish any data on the demographics of their workforce. So the workforce, the demographics, like how many women, was a trade secret. So this was revealed. So the San Jose Mercury News in 2015 filed a Freedom of Information Act to force some of these companies to reveal the demographics of their workforce. And that's when we found out just how bad it was. So I didn't have any connections with the tech industry, but I decided to try to start doing some interviews. So I started spending a lot of time in the Bay Area, hanging out in the places where tech workers hung out. And I thought, I'm going to try to see if I can get people to talk to me. And so I'm just going to share with you a few of the things I learned. This book is based on more than 100 interviews. I interviewed men, women from India, Israel, the US, Mexico, Japan, Korea, Peru, Chile. So I tried to get a range. I interviewed people between the ages of 20 and 58 at the time I started in 2016, so that I covered four generational cohorts. I also wanted to make sure that I interviewed people of different sexual orientations. So 16% of the people I interviewed identified as LGBTQ or non-binary. That enabled me to compare someone who entered the industry as a man, as a cisgender man, and then transitioned. So I have data on people who worked as a female, a male, and then transitioned, and I could compare their experiences, and that was really fascinating. But some of the things I found, I'm going to focus a little bit on the Black women. I interviewed women from all backgrounds. Most of the Asian women I interviewed had origins in India, for the most part, and 90% identify as Brahmin. The other thing I did is sociologists weren't looking at caste. They weren't collecting data on caste. So I also collected data on the caste background, and I found that there was a lot of caste discrimination. When I started my research, there was nothing in the New York Times about caste discrimination. And then when I was in the middle of doing the research, all of a sudden, we started seeing these discrimination cases of Indians who were from the Dalit class, suing their managers for discrimination, for not promoting them. So I have that in here. Here's what I learned. Here are just a few things I learned that countered the earlier literature on the tech industry. So first, sociologists have produced a lot of literature starting in the 1970s on gender discrimination in New York law firms. So the first generation of feminist gender scholars did all this research on women who were tokens, who were tokenized, and how they were treated in New York in the 70s and 80s. So the assumption was that when we get to the aughts, the 2010s, the 2010s, that's not happening. But I found that you had the same forms of discrimination operating in tech that we had documented from the 1970s. It's just they were younger men. We also I found a lot of discrimination against women of childbearing age. Just let me give you one example. The way it plays out is, don't have your baby now. We'll pay for you to get IVF. We'll pay for you to freeze your eggs. We'll pay for you to bank it. But just because you bank your eggs doesn't mean when you hit 35 or 36 that it's going to be a smooth transition. So there was a lot of pressure on women to bank their eggs in their ovum and to freeze them, and that was considered a benefit. Now, some of us might say, yeah, that is a benefit, but the point is, it's a really hostile workplace for women with young children. So a lot of the women I interviewed who were below the age of 40 and had younger children were under a lot of pressure to socialize after work, like go drinking. And so if they got all their work done and they were like, I want to go home to my children, that was used against them when they were evaluated, because it's like, you're not a team player. Not everybody drinks. So I interviewed some women who were not either Muslim or they just weren't big drinkers, and their performance evaluation was damaged by that because they were expected to do these off-site activities, like go to whiskey bars and strip clubs, and because this is a young group that's running it. So the first thing that I learned was that there was a lot of cultural conformity, right? And it's hard to fight that. Like, you're expected to do things together, team building. But most of the team building involved drinking, going to parties, getting into a bikini and socializing. You don't necessarily want to socialize in a bikini. And a lot, but a lot of things that would make you uncomfortable, especially if you were like a super minority. But the other thing I found was that, so in my interviews with white and Asian workers, everybody consistently said, this is a very diverse industry. We hire everybody. But what I learned by the time I got to interview number 80 was the metric used to define diversity was global. So you could work in a company and not have a single black person or a single Latino, but you could say it was diverse because you had people from 5 states in India and Mexico and or Europe. So the global metrics were actually a problem because it was used to elide the discrimination against domestic minorities. So, and people were sincere. And I can understand how if you're from Tamil Nadu, if you're from a certain state in India, how you would view it as diverse if you had someone from a different state, because India is so diverse and there's so, but the problem is the government, the US government allowed this form of discrimination because they could say, see, 50% of our engineers are from India, but you don't have a single black person from Oakland. But that doesn't matter because you can say you have diversity. So there was a lot of discrimination, but it didn't register officially as discrimination, right? So I was very fortunate because I was able, with the help of some friends, to get an apartment. So I was spending a lot of time there. And when I started my research, it was also a period when a new industry emerged called Accelerated Engineering Academies. So these are also known as coding boot camps. So for $10,000 and 10 weeks, you could learn to code. So I interviewed the first cohort of women who went to these coding boot camps. Some of these women were married, they had been in tech, and then they had dropped out for a few years and they wanted to get back in. But the technology moved so quickly, right? And the languages changed so quickly that they needed to upgrade. So I interviewed women who were getting back into tech and or women who just didn't have the social networks to get in. And that was interesting because what I found was among the white women who were engineers, about 1/4 of the women I interviewed got their jobs through a coding boot camp. So the coding boot camps, they're not just teaching you to code, they're integrating you into a network. They're giving you mentors and they're creating a cohort. So that's evidence, I'm thinking of like Rosie the Riveter, that's evidence that you could teach someone to code. Coding's like a language. You can teach someone to code in 10 weeks. It might not be elegant, but you can teach them. So the dirty little secret was that a lot of the people who were hired actually couldn't do the job unless they had an internship or they got on-the-job training. So there was this notion that you had to have a degree in computer science or engineering, but that wasn't true. I would say among the men I interviewed, about 40% were dropouts. If you're a white guy and you dropped out from the right school, if you were a dropout from Harvard or MIT, you could get a job. So you didn't even need the degree, you just need to drop out from the right school. So that, you know what I mean? So the other thing I learned that was really troubling, this relates to Black History Month, is and this was told to me by men who were running startups. They really only hired from a small number of schools. That is from the top Indian institutes of technology and then from Carnegie Mellon, MIT. They did not hire from HBCUs. So Bloomberg Business Week did a cover story in January of 2016. And the cover story was, why doesn't Silicon Valley hire black coders? And what they did was they followed these black students from Howard who were all studying computer science and engineering. Some of them got internships, not one got offered a permanent job at Google. So the other issue was that even if you got a degree, if you didn't go to one, if you weren't embedded in the right alumni networks, you were not going to get hired, right? So there was a sense in which it wasn't a straight meritocratic process. And we know from Pierre Bourdieu, who's a 20th century French theorist, he gives us the concept of cultural capital. If you did not have social capital and you hadn't gone to the right school, it didn't matter what degree you had. And that was really troubling, and that wasn't acknowledged. But what was acknowledged in all of the interviews that I did with white and Asian engineers was that at least 50% of the hiring was through social referrals. So a social referral is, I'm your friend, I'm your sister, I slept with you, I had an affair with you, you're my ex, whatever. That's a social referral. That's the way half of the people got jobs. And that's a cheap way to recruit, right?
In more than one sense.
Right. But see, and that wasn't listed in the reports they submitted to the government, right? Because I also read all the government.
Maybe now. This government. That's great.
But the main point is that you had this discourse that Americans believe in, and that Indians believe in, which is that it's a meritocratic process. It wasn't. There were qualified people, but when you looked at how people actually got jobs, it was usually through social referrals. My sister was here, or my ex-husband wanted to help me get a job, so he referred me. There were people I interviewed who failed all of the interviews, and they told me this, couldn't answer a single question and still got hired. Right?
Yeah.
So the point is that the tech CEOs were lying. They would get on these shows, the PBS NewsHour, and 100 years ago when people watched that, and they would say, we tried to hire some colored people. We tried. We just can't find any in the U.S. But the issue was three things. One, they wanted a more pliable workforce, so it was preferable to hire on the H-1B visa program because they had more control over the workers. They could pay them less, but also they could control them. That's one. Secondly, sociologists have found that people like to hire people who are like them. You have the same religion, you're the same age, you went to the same school, you listen to the same music. And so and this operates everywhere. So there was also what we call homophily. You're hiring people who are just like you. And so that was operating. But the other thing that was operating was that just straight up discrimination against women, against black people, and against Dalits. Now, if you were black and had a British accent, that would be better. Like, that would help you. And so, and the other thing which relates to the DEI is everybody I interviewed who was working in DEI was either a gay man or a black woman. So they saved those jobs for the black women and the gay men. They would put them in the DEI. And these were very accomplished people. So I had a hard time getting this book published. So I got a contract with Oxford University Press. They sent it out, and all the reviewers were like, no, this isn't right. I don't believe this. She only interviewed 100 people. And there was like a lot, and there was also a lot of criticism because I was addressing caste discrimination, and that wasn't something that had been addressed by sociologists. Nobody really wanted to deal with that, and that was before it was starting to get covered. So I got trashed during the review process. And so I went through a year and a half of getting these reviews, and at one point I just was going to give up, and I kept going. Finally I went with NYU. But the point was, I was saying things, I found things that were counterintuitive and that were really troubling because it showed a toxic workplace, not unlike the 1970s New York law firms. And people don't want to believe that these young people were reproducing that, right? Because these were young men, and nobody wanted to believe it. The other issue is that people don't want to hear black people complaining about discrimination. Right? And so this book, I have the voices. I really worked hard to include all the voices of people from really different backgrounds. And the people who really shared the most were the men who were doing the hiring, who would say to me with a straight face, been in the industry 15 years, had never hired a black or a Latino. But they basically hired from their village in India, right? And I'd say, really, you haven't? No, but we have a lot of diversity here. So the thing is, people were well-meaning, and they really didn't see the discrimination. It was like, well, you know, we have 5 languages or 6 languages. I said, yeah, but they're all languages spoken in India, right? And people didn't even speak English. Some of the white women I interviewed complained that English wasn't being spoken in the workplace, and they didn't understand what their colleagues were saying because they were speaking Tamil or not even Hindi, like one of the other languages. So I hope you get the book because I really tried to do justice to the range of experiences that women had. And I also tried to explain how mythologies were operating that reinforced and erased multiple forms of discrimination. And how when we talk about diversity, we have to be careful about what do people mean, like what definitions are they working with. So if I'm from China, let's say I'm from China, yes, I would see diversity as a Chinese American would be diverse because I'm coming from China. Or I would see somebody from India as diverse. So people they cared about diversity, but it was just a form of diversity that allowed racism to continue to operate against U.S. domestics.
Mm.
Oh, I have one more thing to say. So after I did this book, I was very dissatisfied with it. And I had it published as an ebook and an audiobook. But I decided, so after I did this book, I spent 6 months watching every TV show that covered the tech industry. And I looked at the kind of characters, and I realized that a lot of the women I interviewed, none of them are represented in the shows. Like, we don't really see mothers. Mm-hmm. We don't see women. We don't really see women from diverse backgrounds. So I started about 6 months ago creating a series of characters for a TV pilot that I'm writing. And I don't have an agent yet, but I'm hoping that if I can get that on, it will do justice to the experiences and it will diversify representations of women in tech and television. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
You know, your connections with Hollywood. Anyway, right here we're going to go on. Clifford, why don't you take us on and talk a little bit about how the genesis of your book and how you got involved in doing a book that tries to popularize science. We don't, a lot of people at your level don't necessarily do that. They're really, involved in their research. What kind of led you into this, that led to producing of this book called The Dialogues?
Thank you. So, actually didn't grab a copy from the show before the book. Looks like
Oh, yeah.
it's out there somewhere. So yes, black with British accent, by the way.
Can I borrow it?
And yeah, well, also thank you so much for coming and setting this up and for hosting this and so forth. In the spirit of thank you. In the spirit of so much of the planet seems to be going back 100 years, this seems like a positive component of that. Anyway, so this is the book, so I'll open it up in a moment. But you probably have a very certain idea of what you consider a science book to be about. You're maybe a grown-up who's interested in finding out what's been going on in some field of science, and there's a corner of the bookstore you go to, and you find your fellow thus inclined people looking at the books there, and they're awesome books, but they're very, very narrowly defined in terms of what typically constitutes that, or at least until recently I think things have been changing. And so I do a lot of popular science outreach, science engagement in various forms, TV, radio, and so on and so forth, in addition to my research. And over the many years, people often go, when are you going to write the book, right? Because usually at some point, you try and take some time out and maybe write some kind of book. And it's of a certain kind, as I said. It's the expert in their field who's enthusing about that thing that they love and they want to get you excited. And there's, a series of introductory chapters to the basic concepts, and then the last chapter or chapter or two is maybe the thing that they really wanted to tell you about. And that's the standard format, and you can go to a publisher and say, this is what I want to do, and probably have a good conversation. So I decided I didn't want to do that because I wanted to think a bit more about what we're really doing in this enterprise and who are we reaching. And so it's a great thing to do, and I probably will write a book like that one day, but I really wanted to experiment with the idea of rethinking what it is these books are supposed to be doing and how they do it and who are they reaching. And so one of the things that struck me first was the idea that we tend to write, there's the voice of authority telling you stuff, which is great, of course, because someone has spent their time learning about something and they want to share that knowledge. And expertise is a good thing, despite the fact that it seems to be problematic these days. Yeah. So I'm not knocking that, but it's not always the way people want to learn things. And so you will find a lot of people who are interested in science who don't go to that corner of the bookstore because they don't want to read something that reminds them perhaps of being back in the in the classroom and so forth. That mode of communication may be not for them. But it doesn't mean they're not interested in science. The other thing that struck me at the time was that the things we talk about in my field, I work on things to do with quantum physics, the nature of space and time, the early universe, what is everything made of at the tiniest levels of particle physics, what's space and time doing at the quantum level, so I think about the nature of black holes and things like that. These are all things, as I said those things, images were in your mind as to what those things look like. If you typically open a book on that stuff, you will not see any of that. Right? We're encouraged to write words, come up with beautiful, elegant ways of saying things and wonderful analogies and so forth, which are all mostly in words. And occasionally there's an illustration, what have you, but it's mostly primarily prose. Again, nothing against prose, right? Prose is awesome. But it's really interesting to me that we're encouraged to talk about the concepts and the ideas. But actually, when we come up with them as practicing physicists and when we talk to each other, if you visit, for example, the Institute for Theoretical Physics, hi. Lisa's a primary player there. You will find that we are talking to each other on chalkboards, and we're not writing out paragraphs of words. We're drawing diagrams, we're writing equations, we're very visual. And that's actually the way most of us think. Nevertheless, we're encouraged to not communicate that to members of the general public. And that struck me as kind of interesting. So I mulled that over for a while. And addressing the first point, the expert from on high, it occurred to me it'd be interesting to revisit the old format, actually the earliest popular level writing, going back to Galileo, at least in what we think of as modern science, was actually in the form of dialogues. When Galileo talked about his observations that led him to sort of rethink our place in the universe, starting with the solar system and so forth. His observations with telescopes looking at the phases of Venus or the moons of Jupiter. By the way, if you don't know, the next several nights, all of the planets will be in the sky at the same time, about 20 to 25 minutes after sunset. Go out and look, you see them. So Galileo was communicating that to people, and he did that in the form of dialogues. People were tossing the ideas around. Characters are tossing the ideas around. And that way you kind of eavesdrop on those conversations. And it also encourages you to have your own conversations about science, which I think is a really important thing for us to do, for us to engage, to feel we have permission to talk about science and not just leave it to the experts. Extremely important in a real functioning democracy. So all of these things were in my mind as how to do that. So I came up with the idea of maybe doing some dialogues where people toss ideas around. Then the idea sort of grew in that I also wanted to find a way of making the whole thing attractive, that you really want to go in and follow more what the conversation is. And so the idea that you could see the people and who they were struck me as interesting, because we're intensely interested in people, right? You overhear a conversation, you're wondering not just about the conversation, but who are these people, how do they meet, that sort of thing. So I thought that'd be interesting to do. And I thought it'd be interesting for you to look over their shoulder and see a little bit about what might have been scribbled on the napkin when they had that conversation. It's typically what happens with, you grab a thing, you're trying to draw a thing and show a little bit of the idea. So that was where it started. It was mostly going to be prose dialogues with little snapshots of some of those things. And then over the years, as I put it down and went back to doing research and didn't have time or what have you, I would revisit the idea, and the visual component kept growing, and eventually it began to eat the prose. And I was thinking, oh, this is interesting. Wouldn't it be interesting if you could see the people? And I thought, that's really also great, because I really want to encourage people to see themselves in the enterprise of doing science. It's not a bunch of experts over there who have a certain kind of image associated with them that we see in TV shows, what have you. They're everybody. There's a sample of everybody, or at least it should be. So being able to see more of those people seemed really important. So it was going to be a series of dialogues with just the same two people, and then I thought, well, more people and more characters, and that allows you to show a variety of people, because there's many different kinds of scientists. And so the idea kept going, and then one day I realized I just invented the graphic novel. Clearly this is narrative art with characters and what have you, and that's what I should do. It took me a long time to realize that's what I should have been doing, especially ironic because I actually read graphic novels and have since I was a kid. So that was the idea. But now I had to try and pitch this to publishers, and one of the things you learn very early on talking with publishers is that they're very excited about new ideas, but actually they're not. In the sense that anything that, if you cannot walk into a room and go, I'm going to do a book and here's 5 other books that it's kind of very much like, but slightly different. Here's my little take on it, little spin, slightly different, but not too different because there's 5 other books. Here are their numbers and what have you. It's not going to go anywhere, or it's very rare that it goes anywhere because they're very risk averse, and there's some good reasons for that, but also it can be very frustrating. The whole system is set up to be risk averse. So having conversations about, so sitting down and going, I have an idea. I'm going to write a science book about of the kind which there isn't any in existence. Please come with me on this adventure. So that wasn't working so well. What I decided to do was just make the thing, and make the thing I wanted to see in the world, which is often what you're told in publishing. Just write the book you want to see out there in the world. So that had some interesting challenges because I wanted to translate my consumer knowledge of graphic narratives into practical knowledge. I wanted, being the control freak that many theoretical physicists are, I wanted to see if I could do it myself. And there were reasons for that as well, because I had a very fixed idea about what I wanted to do, and a clear line as to what that would look like. And the best way to make that happen is just to do it yourself. I felt that because it's hard to, there's no examples I could really point to. So if I was working with someone, a traditional partnership in the graphic novel world is to have the author and the illustrator. That division of labor didn't really suit what I was trying to do, given that I didn't have examples to point to. I'm sure there are ways it could have worked, and there have been other examples out there where that has worked. But for what I was trying to do, I wanted to just do the experiment myself. And yes, it is something very typical in the world of theoretical physics and perhaps other sciences as well. There's a tendency to want to teach yourself the skills to do that research project. So you go away and you just learn what you need and you go, and it can be very autodidactic, and it ends up being fun and flawed and hard and until you eventually figure out what you're doing, and then maybe you have a way then of parceling it out later on in future projects. But anyway, so all of those things were on my mind. So the other problem then, as Jeffrey hinted at, is that taking time out from research to go do popular level stuff is not always, well, it's seldom looked on positively, even in these times. Very famously, Carl Sagan was despised by many of his colleagues, and considered to be not serious in some ways. And a lot of people, especially these days, when people are trying to, hit all the right metrics to make promotions and what have you, it's very dangerous to do things that are not the standard thing, that you don't get points for. You don't get points for outreach. So I think the advantage for me is that I was a bit more senior than a lot more senior, and so, and also I maybe didn't give as much of a damn as I should, but I also had ways of hiding what I was doing. So I actually never told anyone what I was doing. I took a sabbatical for a semester. I decided I was going to teach myself how to actually draw at the level you need to draw to do graphic novels or what have you. So there's recreational sketching, which we all do from time to time, and that's awesome. And I encourage people to do that. Never say you can't draw. It's not true. By what definition are you saying that? There's ways then of learning how to draw, learning certain kinds of drawing, certain kinds of skill, perfecting them through practice and so forth, through deliberate, being self-aware about the kinds of things you need to improve and what have you. So I wanted to learn that, to learn about production of graphic novels, old school, new school, pen and paper, ink, brushes, digital, all sorts of things. The iPad was coming online around that time, so that was an interesting thing. Halfway through the book, I transitioned a bit to using that more, and all sorts of interesting things. So there's a lot of learning of those sorts of skills, dabbling and engaging with the art world. So for a semester, I actually wandered around art museums in Europe for a while, and that was my office, where I was learning to improve my figurative art. It's not just doing the drawing; it's also knowing that you have to do several hundred of them per that will end up being the drawing, that will end up producing the drawings that will produce one page. So you end up doing thousands and thousands and thousands of drawings. So that requires consistency. So those are the sorts of things. The book then ends up looking, and then really learning about designing the book and so forth. So at the end, it ends up being a series of dialogues, interweaving people having conversation, experts and non-experts. So there's no single author voice. That's deliberate. You're looking over the shoulder of people having dialogues, and instead of being in the classic sort of Socratic dialogues, or in togas on a mountain somewhere, they're in cafes. They're on buses and trains and planes, and maybe not planes, not this one, and jazz cafes and all sorts of things. And they're just places in the world where people have conversations about science, which I think is an awesome thing, which I want to see more of, and actually does happen. People just don't talk about it as much. I wanted also to really show that that's a thing that happens, and capture that. And then it encourages you to have your own dialogues about science. The way you design these things so that it's not too dense, there's a lot of distillation. So it won't be as, per page, there maybe won't be as many concepts as you would get in the written word. And that's okay. It's not meant to replace that. It's meant to be an alternative way of delivering things. But then at the end of each little chapter, which is a dialogue, there's then suggestions for further reading in maybe some of the more traditional books, of which there are many awesome ones. So I'm able to sort of encourage you to go find out more that way. So in the end, I did find a publisher. At first, a little press at Imperial College, but that was mostly championed by one person who then left. The one person there who knew what a graphic novel was super excited because she'd just done a master's course on it, but then she left. So then happily they let me transfer it to MIT Press, who at the time were beginning to expand their physics section and were keen to go on me with that journey, so kudos to them. And it ended up being one of their most successful books for a long time. And the point is trying to make to publishers is that there is an audience for this. I can't show you numbers, but I'm sure they exist. And it turns out they do exist. So now, ironically, most of those publishers that told me that this is not something they want to do now write to me. They now send me manuscripts that people have pitched of graphic books to get my opinion, because this did really well. So it's sort of interesting. So the world is changing, I think. The thing we call science books, serious science books, not just sort of not just aimed in particular areas, right? So not just for adults, not just for kids, but the broad thing that we called science books is expanding. This is a piece of that story. There are other things, creative things that people are doing, but it was fun to be involved in that. The other thing I should say, speaking about some of the things we were talking today, is that I am pleased that this allows me also to represent, as I said, a wide variety of people engaging with science. And I get a lot of response from people about that that particular aspect, the fact that they're really glad to see themselves represented in one way or another. And so people tend to pass it on as a gift to people who are interested in science but maybe don't want to go the traditional route, people who maybe think of themselves more visual in their appreciation of science. This is a way in for some. So.
All right.
Matt,
Oh,
why don't
yeah.
you tell us a little bit about your book?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for inviting me here, and everybody for being here. And so there's two books of fiction: Black Canvas, A Campus Haunting, and Angels of Mercy, Light, and Fog. As Jeffrey said, I am a literary critic, scholar, and also a film scholar. I am writing a book right now on film in the age of Black Lives Matter. And before I got a PhD from Berkeley Golden Bears, I got an MFA in creative writing, and so I've been doing this work for a long time. The first book is a horror novel, and it started off as a memoir. I was trying to write a memoir, and I just couldn't figure out how to get the feel of what I was talking about, right? And so horror gave me a much stronger way to talk about the emotions. And so it's set at Dartmouth College in the mid-1980s. And so, as this is a time where we're talking about these elite institutions and kind of Black access, this is a text that really asks, do you really want to send your children there? Is this a place that, what kind of space are these for Black people, right? And what happens there? So that, horror was the way to really kind of think about and to get a reader to feel the kind of confluence of racism and homophobia and transphobia, right, misogyny, like what all of that feels like, at the same time as being able to talk about desire and pleasure and have funny scenes, right? Because horror allows you to sustain a sense of tension and dread, which is the kind of like the everyday and constant experience of all of those things of racism and misogyny and homophobia and transphobia, right? Like the constancy of that, while also just moving through one's life and other things happening. And so that's how I kind of landed on horror. And I did a lot of historical research for this text, a lot of research about art. This is an ekphrastic novel, so that it is a lot about art and thinking about the Black figures in Western art and how Black people's images have been manipulated and how Black artists do what they do to expand our understanding of kind of Black life and experience and history. So that's what. So this is Black Canvas. That's why it's Black Canvas, because a lot of it takes place at the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth, where I worked as a security guard when I was an undergraduate. So I had a lot of experience with that space and thinking about, like, how does a security guard experience the museum, which is not a perspective that we often really take into consideration, because you're living with the art in a different way all the time. And then Angels of Mercy, Light and Fog was just published. So if the first book was thinking about horror and what I could do with horror as a genre, this one is about erotica and what I could do with erotica as a genre. It's a trilogy of novellas. There's the Angel of Mercy, the Angel of Light, and the Angel of Fog, are 3 different stories. And so the first one, the Angel of Fog, actually starts off about a young Black man who's straight, who really wants to go to a 4-year school and doesn't know how to pay for it, and winds up doing transactional sex with another man, and finds that this is a complicated interaction to have, and how much emotion there is, and also how much pleasure there is in a kind of sexual encounters that he didn't think that he was going to have. So, kind of thinking about the complexity of these things, and also the, this is the each novella is in another, kind of deals with a kind of genre within a genre. That one is romance, and so the complexities of romance and even gay marriage is a part of that story. The next one is more fantasy, and again, each one deals with Black men who are in sexual relationships with white men, and also the kind of everydayness of racial violence, the sexual nature of racial violence, and how white supremacy kind of colludes to be a part of our everyday lives and our most intimate moments. So the second one, as the Avenging Angel of Mercy, is there and really helping to open the eyes of a particular kind of very conservative person, and it's a lot. That story is a lot about the relationship between mercy and vengeance. And the last one, the Angel of Light, is actually I wrote it in relationship to a real live case. Ed Buck in Los Angeles is a very wealthy white Democratic Party donor who murdered multiple young Black men that he brought to his home and paid them to take drugs until they died. At least 2 Black men died that way, and nobody was going to do anything about it until some Black women who were working for the LA Times, who are LA Times reporters, really pushed and pushed and pushed until that story was exposed, and he was eventually is serving time for this. It was just a few years ago. So that story is, again, I go back to the horror genre and think about him as particularly as a vampire. So I go back, and in each one of these are erotic texts, but they also engage with other kinds of forms in order to tell these stories. Again, about the dynamics. It's also about friendships between Black men. There are different kinds of Black men in each one. Some of them are cis, some of them are trans, some of them are straight, some of them are queer, some of them are middle class, some of them are older, so that it just, I was also thinking about the kind of broadly about so many ways that Black men's lives are really reduced to a small way of thinking about, about Black men and masculinity and the varying kinds of also femininities that people have. And so instead, I tried to think about these things in very expansive ways as I was writing and dealing with the characters in different situations. So that's these two, and I'm happy to sign or answer questions.
Thank you. So layered. Yes.
Yeah.
So, Ling, maybe you can bring us home here.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I have notes to keep me on track, so I knew I was last. So wrap it up. Okay, so my book, it's a co-authored book called Dismantling, Disproportionality in Practice, a guide to fostering culturally responsive districts in schools. And I want to start with a James Baldwin quote that we started with in the introduction. It was from James Baldwin's 1963, A Talk to Teachers, and he said, "To any citizen of this country who figures himself as responsible, and particularly those of you who deal with the minds and hearts of young people, must be prepared to go for broke. Or to put it another way, you must understand that in the attempt to correct so many generations of bad faith and cruelty, when it is operating not only in the classroom, but in society, you will meet the most fantastic, the most brutal, and then most determined resistance. There is no point in pretending that this won't happen." And I feel like this really resonates now as we're dealing with so much in society, and especially in education. Who's leading this World Wrestling lady is, our expert right now, our leadership. So there's a lot going on.
Got a
That's my
witness.
baby. So this book kind of urges us, are we gonna go for broke, as James Baldwin puts it? So this came from my co-authors are full-time trainers and technical assistance providers in state education agencies and local education agencies across the country, and so they do a lot of work in schools, particularly schools that are cited for disproportionality, and disproportionality meaning that there's an over-representation of Black and brown students in special education, or they are over disciplined and suspended in schools. And so the book offers resources and tools to address disproportionality and resources to support them. And to speak towards Black student and Black education, sadly, Brown versus Board, which was that decision over 71 years ago, though it's really celebrated around educational equity, it really damaged Black education in the way because it massively pushed out Black teachers and Black principals, and our students are really suffering from this. In California, Black students are about 5% of the population, whereas teachers are still nationally about 80% white, and in California 61% white, and the other highest percentage is Latinx at 21%. So though Black students are only 5%, you'll still see them overrepresented again in over-disciplined and over-enrolled in special education and lacking resources to be supported in schools. So I'm actually working with a district right now here in California, somewhere in this county actually, and from the work I'm doing with these youth, I'm working with Black high school students in the district, and they are not safe holistically, they're not safe physically, they're not safe socially, emotionally, they're not safe interpersonally, they're not safe academically when they step into their classrooms. They'll come in and students are saying the N-word around them, teachers will barely acknowledge it. Students have recounted stories of having the N-word written on their desk or outside on lunch tables, and a teacher will just say like, oh, okay, let me erase it, and then move on and not address it. You've had teachers commenting on students' hair, asking if it's real, touching it. You'll have teachers commenting or coaches commenting on hey, your dress reminds me of a character in Roots. And so it goes on and on and on. It's a very violent space. And so, I really believe that this work is, it's really bad. It's really bad. And so we have to do better. And so the hope is that, this book provides, it doesn't just tell you how bad everything is, because we know that, but that it also offers resources and tools and is kind of a guidebook of how to do that work. And okay, just minutes. So this book it will talk schools, district leaders around first doing that really personal work around what are your values and beliefs that impact how you run schools. How does whiteness shape how you are interacting with students, and like what curriculum that you're using that might ignore histories of students of color, or views variation in language and cultural practices as othered and through deficit lens instead of supporting and centering students and their cultural repertoires. And speaking of students, I just want to highlight one part of the book, which is chapter 5, which is really, I think, my heart. And chapter 5 discusses a youth participatory action research project that I did in a large school district, Northeast. Many of you know this district. But we brought together students from all over the district, from like specialized high schools who are really high achieving, and then like students who had very few resources, and it was a racially mixed group. And so we got to do some political education with them to help them understand the context of education in terms of race and gender and ability. We talked about, like, for example, the model minority myth. We talked about racial segregation in housing and how that impacts schooling. And they were really into it. And this district's really big, it's really diverse, but it's also really segregated. So it was a rare opportunity for students to come together and talk about their experiences as a collective. And then we ended up doing a YPAR study where they had a survey, and they asked their peers to draw 2 things. They asked them to draw, what does it feel like to be you in school? And then what do you want, like what's your vision of schooling that would be ideal for you? And it was really interesting what we found. There was about 9 schools that participated, and about 500 surveys were taken, mostly of students, but some adults like teachers took the survey as well. And we learned so much about how they felt being in school. And you saw that Black students and students of color were not having a great time, and that they often talked about how, teachers were yelling at them, or principals were yelling at them. It's like, actually, you could just ask me instead of, can you do something, or not assume that I'm doing something wrong. Some students just drew like them in jail at school, but they, drew other pictures of, the ideal version is just them having like a fluid place to really learn and to expand and like fulfill their potential and just be themselves and feel seen, which was really important. So it's, I think, important to center the youth in this work, because oftentimes when technical assistance trainers go into schools, you're often just working with the adults, and you're not asking what students want or need. And so adults are kind of still centering themselves in what they think is the best for students. And so when we worked directly with the students, they were able to really humanize themselves in the data, because we know, like, the data shows that like Black students and some students of color are not achieving as well, but you could see what their stories were and to contextualize the data in that way. And I think that was helpful. They did use this project to then speak at different conferences and try to turnkey this information in their own schools and push for change. And so that was really inspiring. So yeah, I'm gonna end on that note with centering the youth. I want to say that this book is really written with love, because we really do care about our future, our youth. Like, they matter, and we want to support them so that they can help us get us out of this mess. So thank you so much. Thank you for being
I know Mike Michael suggested we have a group discussion, but I don't know if we're at the point where we kind of
Overstayed no welcome.
well, that's one of yeah. I mean, I am interested in this question of how the challenges that people reflect on, maybe the challenges of doing this kind of interdisciplinary work in a research one university where, you know, research is often thought of as very specialized and narrow. It seems like everybody here is breaking the narrowness and expanding the genre. So I don't know if anybody up here maybe could comment on that, or from what you've heard from what we've been talking about.
I just want to say how impressed I am that you learned to draw.
Right.
I still can't draw, and I do art, but I just want to say I think it's very difficult before you have tenure to break this, because we're in a system of academic apartheid where each discipline has its own metrics for what counts. And I've been very privileged to be in a sociology department that tolerated, you know, my research, but I think it's really tough to break through. And I think that the only way you can do it is you have to have initiatives at your institution. I experienced this when I was at Duke. They actually had initiatives to reward people for interdisciplinarity, but if you don't have that, it's very difficult to do what you're doing without having already gotten tenure. And like you said, you did stealth, like subterfuge.
Right.
Like you don't tell. Like I'm on sabbatical now. I'm not telling people what I'm really doing. And so you can't. It's a challenge.
Yeah.
I gather, and I don't know this, I haven't been at UCSB for long enough, I gather that more than many institutions, there is a spirit, in maybe not on this grander scheme as some of the things we're talking about, there is some spirit of encouraging being entrepreneurial across the campus, sort of finding ways to collaborate across the way. It's a lot worse at other places, I've gathered, but that's not necessarily
Not really the reference point.
the reference point.
I mean, I think what you've done, I think you have to be creative and brave, but I also think, in a way, we have to lead the administrators.
Yeah.
We have to tell, even what you did in publishing, you have to show them, yes, there's a market.
Yeah.
I think the thing we're up against in the university system is the way that businesses, there's this notion that if you can't prove what you're teaching has commercial value, you know what I mean? Like there's a way in which you have to say this will help you get a job in X, Y, or Z fields. And that's actually antithetical to what you're doing.
Yeah, and Matt, I mean, the way in which you kind of went, I was saying to you earlier that, you know, we often spend a lot of time studying these genres like the Harlem Renaissance, but to actually, okay, I'm going to contribute. That's a big step. It takes a lot of courage to do that.
Well, you know, this is, again, I was doing this from before I was even in graduate school for a PhD. I already had another kind of graduate training. But, you know, I think that there is a lot to say about the incredible intellectual work of Black creativity, and in all of its forms, in terms of art, in music, in dance. I mean, I think this is what, you know, Alain Locke was alluding to in his anthology, as he was gathering all of these different kinds of people and also highlighting the art, and, you know, in between the chapters with these, you know, the gorgeous stencils and everything else that's in there that helps to playwrights, like, you know, that's a text that has so many different kinds of work in it that it helps us to understand that Black intellectual traditions are varied and expansive, and that, you know, it is in the scholarly kind of writing, but also in the graphic work. It is in the ways that we approach scholarship and who we interview and kind of our intellectual contributions are incredibly important and strengthen academia. And I fear that this is a moment where all of that is getting questioned and lost in very ugly discourses at the national level that really disparage what we do in all of its forms as inconsequential and unintellectual, and it's just a lie.
I think you've chosen the perfect genre, though, horror.
Yeah.
I was just saying to someone the other day, I feel like I'm living in a horror movie every time I get up and hear the news.
That's right.
So you chose a genre that works.
But I also like the activism that I think you epitomize, Ling, where you're out there engaging with youth. So much is talking about youth and not actually dialoguing. It's kind of connection with you. You're dialoguing with youth. I think the dialogue is a theme that kind of runs through this whole panel here.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how it goes. The school district I'm working with is upset with me because I sent them a whole letter of things that should be addressed. They knew what was going on, but I just made it a little more public. But the superintendent called my dean. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, at least you got to hear from him.
Dialogue.
Well.
We had a conversation. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, I think that activism piece is important because I could have taken the information and then published it and never saw them again. But I think it's important to have that dialogue and that action.
Well, thank you all, and maybe just open it up for some questions. I know we're running over time a little bit, but I'm just so glad to be up here with you and to be here in Chaucer's, which has been such a home for me.
It's a real treat.
I mean, because sometimes I come in here and I'm whipped, and I just walk around and I see a book. Wow, they wrote on this. I feel so much better in this place. So I'm so glad that it's been an institution that's been able to really sustain. So thank you, Chaucer.
Thank you.
Come on, somebody has to have a question for.
I'll just make a comment. The range of work on this panel illustrates exactly what you're saying. Such different things are done here and have been expressed methodologically, breaking the rules. It's just totally impressive. Pulling this panel together was great.
That's great. I'm inspired by these people because you guys are, there's like obviously a small group of people, but also a very supportive group of people here. And I think that I feel like we're supported a lot in Santa Barbara, and it really is great to be here.
And on that note, thank you so much, everyone. Clifford, Winddance, Ling, Mr. Richardson, and of course, Jeffrey. Thank you so much for coming here and talking.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you.